I'm speaking to you from Meanjin, otherwise known as Brisbane, the unceded lands of the Turrbal and Yagara people. Aboriginal Australians have occupied this vast landscape for upwards of 60,000 years. And my story is set in Tasmania, which was originally named by the Palawa, the traditional custodians, Lutrawita, a name which is having its resurgence. And there are parallels between what happens in my story to the Selkies and the Seals with what happened in history to the Palawa people when first sealers and then convicts and then settlers arrived in their country. But first, I would like to invite you, even though I won't be able to hear you with my ears, I might be able to feel you with my heart. We might be able to feel each other. If you could possibly join in the refrain, whether you think you can sing or not, of a little sea shanty inspired tune. And the refrain goes, here on the land beside the sea, my heart belongs to you, my love. Here on the land beside the sea, but every night she calls to me. Here on the land beside the sea, don your skin and roam in me. Here on the land beside the sea, so here's a kiss, for I must leave. Here on the sand beside the sea, but like the tide I will return. Here on the sand beside the sea, for my heart belongs to you, my love. Here on the land beside the sea. The Selkie of Lutrawita. A storm was brewing and gale force winds were blasting up from Antarctica. As she gazed at the turbulent clouds, she didn't know if she wanted to live or die. But a prayer rose from her lips. If it is to be my fate, to be the last of my kind, I beg you, take me to a place where humans see more than skin and oil when they look upon a seal. And with that, a mountain of a wave scooped her off her rock as if she were a piece of kelp and slammed her deep down underneath the warring waves, tossing her this way and that until she didn't know which way was up or down, which way was north, south, east, or west. And when at last the storm had eased and the morning broke, she found that she was washed up on a strange shore in a sheltered cove, and she was in the shadow of a great white lighthouse. She was bruised and exhausted, so she closed her eyes and went to sleep. Now, the lighthouse keeper always found that after his night shift keeping the light burning, a brisk walk on the beach was refreshing. And after the night that he had just had, he needed it more than ever. Mountainous waves had slammed the lighthouse all night long until there was kelp stuck halfway up the outer wall of the lighthouse. One wooden shed had been completely washed away, and despite everything, he managed to keep the light burning, praying all the while that any ship in the region had reached safe harbour before this tempest struck. As he went to walk on the beach, he was slightly daunted by what he might find washed up. But what he did find was mountains of kelp, as he expected, tangled with ship's rope, with barrels of oil and empty bottles of rum and sea life that hadn't survived the storm, some flapping fish that had survived. This time, there was no treasure and, thankfully, no human corpses. But just as that thought occurred to him, he rounded a corner and a beam of light, a single sunbeam, lit a lone figure up ahead on the beach. He ran towards it, praying, please, God, let it be alive. Let it be alive. And as he drew nearer, he gazed closely at the ribs to see if there was life, to see if there was breath. And after a time, he realized the ribs were shallowly moving. It was alive. Praise God. He ran back to his cottage and brought back a tin pail. He filled it with the fresh fish that had just been washed up in the storm, poured it near the seal's head, and stepped back to see what the seal would do. She opened her eyes, gazed at the man, calculated that he was not a threat, but even if he was, she didn't really have the energy or the ability to move yet. She gulped down his offering, and then, exhausted, she closed her eyes again and went back to sleep. The lighthouse keeper checked on the seal every day. He hadn't had anyone or anything to care for since his wife had died, and now he found himself whistling as he worked. Every day he would bring the seal fish until it was strong enough to go hunting itself. And often he would see it swimming out in the waves. But often when he finished his shift, he would discover it lying in the sun on a rock as if it knew he was coming. And slowly he would sit a little closer and a little closer until the seal accepted him sitting right next to him. And sometimes they would sit together in silence. And sometimes he would tell stories, because since he had left the old country, he hadn't really encountered many humans that he felt comfortable with. But strangely, he felt more comfortable with this seal than any people he'd met since he'd taken this isolated post. And he told stories of Orkney, his home. He told stories of his family, of his wife, and how she had died. He told stories of Selkies that he'd been told as a child. And the Selkie thought to herself, he's a good storyteller, nearly as good as my grandmother. And while he was there beside her, his voice and his presence eased her suffering and her grief. It ebbed just a little. But one day, the lighthouse keeper told the Selkie a story that really made her sit up and listen to every word. He said, I've never told anyone this before, but I had a slightly quirky aunt who used to tell me all these fantastical stories. And as a child, I never doubted that any of them were true. But as I grew older, I realized they were fairy tales. And as I grew into a young man, I wondered if perhaps the family was correct. She was a loony. Because one of the stories that she maintained was absolutely true, was that our family had Selkie blood, and that I had cousins with webs between their fingers and toes. Well, I'd never seen any evidence of it. And I laughed it off. But now that I'm older and I've lived by the sea, and I was a sailor for some time too, I've seen things in the ocean that make me wonder. Maybe there were Selkies in the old country. Maybe there is Selkie blood in my veins. I dream of it often enough. And when he looked to see if the seal was listening, he saw that she was staring at him, her big brown eyes locked with his. I could swear you understand me, every word. Strange and unsettled. He got up and he doffed his cap and he said, well, until tomorrow, my friend. And he rushed off to polish the lamp. But this is what gave the Selkie courage. The next full moon rose swollen and golden, and for the first time in an age, she shed her sealskin and she danced naked on the beach. She sang and she laughed and she wept, for her sisters were not with her. And when she was finished, she walked, her long silver hair spilling down her naked back, up to the lighthouse keeper's cottage, and she knocked on the door. And when the lighthouse keeper heard a knock at the door, he was perplexed, to say the least. He lived on an isolated island, far from anyone, the only people who ever came with a supply ship, and they never came at night. So when he opened the door and saw, silhouetted in the moonlight, this naked woman with silver hair, he presumed that he was looking upon a ghost, until she broke the silence and she said, I thought you said you believed in Selkies. aren't you going to invite me in? Oh, come in. I'm sorry. And he opened the door wide and he welcomed her inside and he gave her the guest seat by the fire, wrapped her in a warm cloak and fed her some warm stew. And thus began the courtship of the lighthouse keeper and the Selkie. And though he gave her his wife's clothes to keep her warm, they didn't live as man and wife at first. They just talked and he listened. And slowly her stories spilled out of her as he listened. And she told him of her people's great migration from the old country, which was very close to his old country of Orkney, and how over the generations they had come all the way down to this beautiful land. And that when her ancestors had arrived, they thought they had found paradise. It was so wild, it was so abundant. And the humans who lived in this place, they lived together in relative peace. And while they had to be wary of the Palawa, because they did hunt seals, over some generations, the Palawa discerned the difference between Selkies and seals. And so they rarely troubled them. But like the Selkies, the Palawa only ever hunted for as much as they could eat and no more. And so they lived in peace in this beautiful place. And she told him of the coming of the white sealers and how everything changed. And how in the time it takes for a child to become fully grown, they had wiped out the entire population of seals, leaving just a few, and as well had wiped out almost all of her family until there were only a few of them left. She told them of the day that she had gone hunting alone. It was a good catch in the kelp forests, but when she returned, she found her family and her pups cold, silent, still, their skins removed and flies gathering on their revealed flesh. She told them how she stayed with them for days, uncertain what to do, until the moon rose full. And then she swam after the sealers and she followed them to the cove where they were camped. And in the moonlight at night, she shed her skin. And in human form, she crept stealthily to their large rowing boat. They only had one. And she found the bung lid, for she'd heard stories of how the humans have a drainage hole in the bottom of their boats, and that if you open it, it will make the boat sink. And so carefully she undid the bung lid. Just as the sealers were alerted, she slipped on her seal skin and escaped into the ocean, their bullets missing her. And she deposited that bung lid out into the depths of the ocean. And she told him that after escaping the sealers, the storm had hit. And she told him of her prayer. And she told him of how the storm had delivered her to his shore. Well, now living in human form for such an extended period, in close proximity to a healthy, loving man, the Selkie began to experience sensations in her body that she had never experienced as a Selkie. Because when she took human form as a Selkie, it was only briefly. But now, feelings arose that made her want to explore the lighthouse keeper in a new way. And so they did. She was lithe and sensuous, and he had the heart of a poet. And their lovemaking was like riding a long, delightful wave together. They had children, lots of them. They wanted to keep the Selkie line going. And she kept her seal skin in a box that he made specially for her. She oiled it lovingly. And on the full moon, she would go down to the beach and she would dance naked under the moon and sing mournful songs. And on the new moon, she would don her seal skin and go roaming out in the deep, wide ocean. And when their children were old enough, the ones with webbed fingers and toes would join her in the ocean. And sometimes the family would join her dancing under the full moon too. And the family lived as happily as was possible in such brutal times, in such an isolated place. The Selkie was a terrible cook and a terrible housekeeper because Selkies have no interest in keeping house. But luckily, the lighthouse keeper was a good cook, and he taught the children how to cook, while the cobwebs gathered thick dust and the house was always a mess. But the Selkie was a magnificent fisher, and they were never short of seafood with a mother like that. And though they were happy, when their father was at the lighthouse at work, the children sometimes noticed tears rolling down the Selkie's face, for there were things that she had seen that had left their mark. And though she loved her new family, nothing could replace her old family and the life that she had had in the sea. But at night, around the fire, they would gather and they would tell stories of the old people in the old ways. She taught them words and songs from her people, so the children knew who they were. And if you ever meet anyone who tries to tell you that there are no such thing as Selkies, or that the last Selkie of Lutrawita died long ago, you tell them the true story. You tell them the story I just told you, the Selkie of Lutrawita.